Welcome to another edition of Respond to Resilience. We're your hosts, David Dachinger and Dr. Stacy Raymond. And on this episode, we'll be speaking with Kelly Lynch, the owner of Turning Point Wellness, LLC, about nutrition practices for first responders. We'll be right back after this. When I was trained to become a firefighter and an EMT, very little time was devoted to educating us about job-related stress, burnout, trauma, sleep disruptions, and mental health. We didn't know that there were life-saving resources, resilience strategies, and support groups that help first responders to cope with anxiety, depression, and stress. It's a huge understatement to say that first responder mental health is in crisis. Fire, police, and EMS are professions where more die by their own hands than by the hazards of the job. And research shows that up to a quarter of public safety dispatchers have symptoms of PTSD and depression. In this silent worldwide crisis, first responders are quietly suffering due to stigmas around mental health services and lack of awareness about vital resources that are available to assist them. We can help the helpers. Welcome to Respond to Resilience, a panel of experts sharing their wisdom and experience from the front lines of first responder health and wellness. I'm David Dachinger, retired fire lieutenant and EMT with over 20 years as a leader in emergency services. Dr. Stacy Raymond is a clinical psychologist and is an approved EMDR and trauma specialist. Half of her practice is dedicated to first responders and military veterans. Stacy co-leads a weekly peer support meeting for first responders along with Bonnie Rumilly. Bonnie is a licensed clinical social worker specializing in the treatment of adults, adolescents, children, and first responders. Bonnie worked in Newtown treating trauma directly after the Sandy Hook school shootings and is an EMDR therapist. A board member of the Fairfield County Trauma Response Team, Bonnie's also a 21-year emergency medical technician. Our guest on this episode is Kelly Lynch. Kelly is a licensed clinical social worker, otherwise known as LCSW, a personal trainer and nutrition coach. And Kelly's been an EMT since 2003, worked in commercial EMS as an EMT and FTO for 10 years prior to becoming a therapist. Kelly's been a therapist for almost 13 years and specializes in acute stress and post-traumatic stress injuries in EMS professionals. She opened Turning Point Wellness in 2014 with the goal of normalizing mental wellness in public safety to change the stigma of asking for help, and that's huge, and to increase access and availability of appropriate support services to all professional and volunteer first responders. Kelly, welcome to Respond to Resilience.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Kelly, let me start out by asking you just if you could just tell us a bit about your history working in EMS and how did that lead to your interest in nutrition?
Sure. So I became an EMT in 2002 is when I took my class, and then I really started on the road in 2003. I started out as a volunteer with Stratford EMS, hung out there for about a year and a half or so. And in that year and a half, I ended up actually getting hired by Bridgeport AMR. So I was with AMR from 2003 to 2006, and then I moved around in Connecticut. So I moved up to Hunter's Ambulance in late 2006, and I was there for just shy of 7 years, where I was also an FTO for 4 of those years. I call being an EMS my happy accident. It was my Bob Ross moment. I was living in Boston at the time when 9/11 happened, and decided Boston was not for me. Came back to Connecticut and really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life at that point. And I had not only an urge to do something to give back and help after 9/11 happened, but I had some things going on in my family that I wanted to be able to have a better education around how to handle. And EMS seemed like the most logical route. So EMS just kind of happened. And I never intended on getting into the commercial side of public safety and EMS in particular, but ended up loving it once I started volunteering, and it became part of who I am. So in terms of how I got involved in nutrition, so part of it was just really me being interested in it and wanting to learn more just because, but also seeing it from a therapy end of things, how much we're impacted mentally and emotionally because of our nutrition habits, and then watching that happen with former partners, clients, colleagues, and really wanting to understand more about just our gut health and how much we're impacted by our, so to speak, second brain, really drove me to want a better education around what that looks like.
Interesting career path. And it's fascinating how sometimes one door opens and it opens to another door. And
absolutely.
Sounds like you embrace that change. So that's great. So you mentioned the gut and gut brain health. What's the connection and why does that actually matter?
So most of the time, most people really aren't aware of how impactful our gut health is when it comes to our mental health. As an example, one of the things that I usually throw out there is 90% of our serotonin is actually manufactured in our gut system. Serotonin is something that most people are aware of, or at least familiar with, that this is one of our happy chemicals, right? It's one of the things that we manufacture that makes us feel good or makes us feel relaxed. But if our gut health is off, we're going to manufacture either less of it and not feel as good, or we're going to absorb nutrients from our food in a way that isn't helpful, which then impacts how we manufacture these neurochemicals. Our adrenal glands sit in our gut. We have 2 adrenal glands, and they sit on top. One of each is on top of our kidneys. Our adrenal glands are where our adrenaline comes from, right? So like if our adrenal glands are not functioning properly because of our gut health, we're going to manufacture things in a way that isn't helpful.
So you mentioned serotonin. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the antidepressants are SSRIs, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Do you think partly because of diet, that we're actually having to increase the amount of serotonin that stays within the brain? Do you think that there's a connection there?
I think that there is a connection. I think it's a little bit of a loaded question, though, because there's so many different factors when it comes to medication that are important for us to take into account of that. Are there nutrition factors that need to be corrected in somebody? Are there environmental factors where they're dealing with something in a different way than what is actually helpful? Are there biological factors where they have a medical issue where they're just not going to absorb certain nutrients properly, right? Like if we look at something called the MTHFR genetic abnormality, this is an abnormality that is very, very common actually in our population. I believe the statistics is something around 40% of our population actually has this genetic abnormality, and it is grossly underdiagnosed, but that's going to impact how you absorb your B vitamins.
Interesting.
And if we look at B vitamins, so much of that is related to how we feel energy or how we experience whether or not we're actually physiologically energized. So all of these things are directly related to our food and our nutrition choices.
Wow, very interesting. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, since first responders with all their shift work and how busy they are, some of them work 80, 100 hours a week. I wanted to ask you about meal prep and how would that best serve first responders?
So I'm a huge fan of meal prep. And if I could get more of my first responder clients to engage in meal prep, I would be a very happy therapist. So I think there is no one particular right or wrong way to go about meal prepping. It's a matter of taking into account what is somebody's shift work look like? What's their lifestyle look like? Do they live alone? Are they with a partner who can support them in that? There's a lot of information that needs to be gathered first in order to set somebody up for success when it comes to meal prep. Personally, I'm a single mom, and so my world revolves around meal prep. And even as a nutrition coach, people get very surprised when they hear about my food habits. I cook once a week. And for me and for my daughter, that works really, really well. But we end up eating the same thing for dinner every single night for the whole week. If I were to look at somebody like my mom and say to her, well, I want you to meal prep and here's how I want you to do it, that would be the absolute wrong strategy for her because she wants to eat something different every single day, which is fine. It's a matter of taking into account who is a person in terms of what they want and what they need, what they enjoy, and then setting the strategy up around that instead of trying to force them to fit to the strategy itself. So for me, like I said, I cook once a week. For other folks, it could be that they need to bulk prep a bunch of different things and stick them in the freezer so they can pull them out and have a different meal every single night. For other folks, it could be they want to cook 2 or 3 times a week, but no more than that. It really just depends, and we need a lot of information to set that strategy up for success.
Right, because I think it's so much easier for first responders just to eat on the fly, just
Absolutely.
go get fast food. I don't have time. So is that what you run into a lot?
Definitely. And so the things that I end up talking about with my clients is, okay, if we're going to be short on time, how can we reduce the amount of resistance that there is to meal prep? So if their day off is a Sunday, just for conversation's sake, let's make a grocery store trip and come home and take 4 hours out of that day to just focus on bulk prepping, say 4 different meals and a bunch of different snack foods, so that when they have to just grab and go, everything is already portioned out and they literally can just open up the fridge, pull out a meal, pack it into a lunchbox, and they're off and running.
Okay. Does it help to have different sized Tupperwares or some kind of containers that kind
Absolutely
of facilitate it?
Yes. Yeah. I have, for my own habits, I have containers that are anywhere from 1 cup to 4 cups. And I find that is a really good strategy for most folks that I try to teach this to.
Great. And here's something we hear about all the time. And I know they're trying to make it part of the culture, at least in the fire service, in the fire academy, giving every recruit a big 2.5 gallon water jug. And that's hydrating. We hear about, drinking water, how important it is. Well, why is it actually important?
Our frontal lobe stops working properly when we're dehydrated. Even just a slight amount of dehydration causes our frontal lobe to reduce in 3% increments. And if we think about what the frontal lobe is in charge of, our frontal lobe manages all of our objective reasoning. When our objective reasoning is affected, right, there's going to be increased amounts of decision fatigue. We're going to have to think harder and longer about the things that we're wanting to do and why we're wanting to do that. When, as a first responder, you don't have a lot of time to sit and say, maybe I want to do it this way, or maybe I want to do it that way. You just have to decide and go. So being able to make sure that we're hydrated and fed properly and well really impacts the way that we're able to show up to our jobs.
And I've read a few things that are kind of conflicting about things like coffee, tea. When we're hydrating efficiently, what are the best things to drink?
Water. Period. Listen, I love coffee as much as the next person. I have my running joke with my daughter is that my coffee cups in my house are the size of my head. So I love coffee. I'm a big fan, but coffee is not a food group.
I want to go back to the frontal lobe deficit that you end up with if you're dehydrated. That's where, we notice consequences, or we think about consequences. So if you, I think about first responders as having issues with impulsivity, either angry outbursts or just the grabbing and eating or grabbing and drinking alcohol or whatever, making decisions without thinking of the consequences. So what you're saying is if we're dehydrated, then that further compromises that impulsivity and not really looking at consequences.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I wanted to ask you a question about how nutrition contributes to self-care as a first responder. But before we get to that part, and I'm sure you as a therapist have noticed that a lot of first responders come from families where they have been in roles where they have to take care of others or that they themselves were not really taken care of. Mm-hmm. Right? That they were neglected in some way, or there was an absent parent, or there was an alcoholic parent.
Yep.
Isn't it a lot to ask first responders to now put yourself first when it comes to food? I know that that's a great idea, but how do you get over that obstacle?
A lot of CBT. So I think it's a great point. And yes, absolutely. It's a lot. And it is one of the main things that I end up talking about with a lot of my clients of how do we kind of restructure what we prioritize or who we prioritize and why we do it in a specific order. Mm-hmm. Being able to look at how we manage prioritizing ourselves. One of the examples I give, it's kind of a corny example, but it rings true for most people when we talk about it. If you're on a flight going somewhere and they give that pre-flight check, right? Like therapists use this example all the time, but we don't think about things very often in this particular way. When they give that pre-flight check, when they're talking about the oxygen masks dropping down in case there's an emergency mid-flight, they always say, put your mask on first, because if you're not okay, how in the world are you going to help anybody else?
True.
Right. And, if we take that very simple example, even if it's a corny example, and apply it across the board in the rest of our lives, how are you going to be able to effectively show up and help somebody else if you're not okay first? Right. I just went on a trip to Tennessee without my daughter, and she looked at me and she was like, Mommy, she's 8.5. She said, Mommy, I want to go with you. I want to go on a vacation. I want to go on an airplane because airplanes are the coolest thing to her right now. And I said to her, no, this is a trip that's just for me. It was a work trip, but it was also this is just for me kind of trip. And she needed to stay here to be in school. So I explained to her, this is just for me for right now. And being able to model that for her and what that looks like of, I'm going to teach you through my own behaviors, how I prioritize myself. It doesn't mean I love you any less, but it means in order for me to love you the way that you need, I have to love me first. When we do that and we kind of walk out what that looks like, we then as clinicians can start to model that for our clients, but then show them, hey, when you do this particular thing in this particular way, you're prioritizing yourself over your loved ones so that you can love them better. Right. Every time I have a client show up to a session and stuff like this comes up, I always turn it around on them and say, why'd you show up today? Why are you here? And that resonates with them of that by them showing up and choosing themselves to set that time aside to take good care of themselves instead of doing something else. They're prioritizing their own self-care.
Right. There's such resistance there, I think, like I said, because of the family of origin dynamics, you know, and why a lot of people go into becoming first responders, kind of neglecting themselves, putting themselves aside and being there for other people. It's why they hesitate to come into therapy. It's why they hesitate to take time and meal prep. It's why they hesitate to work out, exercise, get the stress out that way. Right. So it's so important that people learn as first responders to also take care of themselves. So
exactly.
Well, it's shift gears a little bit, and from my experience working in fire and EMS, I've seen a lot of people struggle with obesity. And there was a recent article in GEMS about obesity in EMS. They were citing research that shows like 75% of emergency responder recruits are already overweight or obese.
Mhm.
So why is that, and what do you think we can do about it?
Well, I think part of it comes right out of what Stacy had started to talk about, of that, we come from these families of origin with all of these stories and experiences where we're taught not to prioritize ourselves for any number of different reasons, but then the culture perpetuates it. Shift work perpetuates it. When we're fatigued and chronically stressed, we hold that stress in visceral fat in our abdomen areas. And there's so many different contributing factors, and being able to understand how to look at all of them as individual factors, but then in the totality, and how to mitigate them really matters.
So, Kelly, do you think that, like, after a bad call, not just in EMS, but in any of the first responder professions, that there's like a false belief that you're taking care of yourself if you then, because there's this emotional eating that can happen.
Yep.
Right? I'm feeling something, I feel out of sorts, and then, well, these donuts look good right now, or these Doritos look good right now, and
Or the coffee and the smoke.
Coffee, yeah, and the Red Bull.
Yep.
And there's like that they can give themselves permission to, I guess, meet their emotional needs in that way, but it's obviously not productive. How do you switch out of that so that there won't be this propensity of obesity? Also, dispatchers, there's a statistic that I'm familiar with, 58% of dispatchers are obese.
Yep.
As well. And that is a sedentary job. They're not really moving around like a firefighter, EMT, police officer. So that might be kind of just built into the sitting in front of a screen. So how do you help people break out of that and not, so that they don't become overweight and then further depressed or down on themselves?
Sure. One of the things that I have found really hits home with a lot of my clients is understanding the difference between self-indulgence and actual self-care. And when we go to food as a self-soothing mechanism, that's a very self-indulgent behavior. It's the quick hit of instant gratification. It's the quick hit of, okay, if I do this, I'm going to immediately feel better. But then it drops off really fast.
Oh, sure.
Right? It's not lasting. And so when we talk about actual self-care, there isn't necessarily that quick hit of instant gratification, but there's the slow burn and the build, because self-care practices build on themselves. So when we talk about, or when I talk about self-care with my clients, especially in terms of food, we talk about what motivates food-related behaviors and what's helpful, what's neutral, what's harmful, and understanding what each one looks like. Breaking it down in terms of like the psychoeducation around the behavior and normalizing the why behind the what is really, really helpful. And that's something that we don't do often enough.
Right. And I think instead of going to people, there's a substitute with food. Like, it's so easy. It doesn't involve impinging on anyone else, burdening them with whatever's on your mind. I also think that, again, first responders not coming from families where it's been a reliable source of help to go to somebody. So then food becomes that self-soothing. So and
I think to that point too, it's also really important to hit on the topic of vulnerability, of that first responders across the board, regardless of what facet of the public safety world that we exist in, have a really difficult time talking about what they feel and why they feel it, because it's vulnerable. And especially when you're on shift, right? If we look at Kevin Gilmartin's book, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, and how he talks about the biological roller coaster in this book. If there's any first responder that I could ever talk to, the first thing that I want to say is read this book.
Sure.
It is so helpful. So in his book, he talks about the biological roller coaster of being up in a hypervigilant state when you're on duty, because that's how we know how to keep ourselves safe. And then when we come home, we want to drop into that hypovigilant state and crash and sit in front of the TV and do nothing, right? when we're in our hypervigilant state or in our hypovigilant state. Nobody wants to talk about what they feel and why they feel it. We just want to feel better.
Right. And there are things you can put into your mouth that can bring you out of feeling down, right?
Exactly.
So there's the caffeine, or that can take you off, that can lower the high, like alcohol or Xanax or something. Yeah.
Yep.
And so those habits are not healthy ones.
Right. Right. So a lot of education around how to be vulnerable and how to sit with that and ask for help, like all of this goes around food behaviors. One impacts the other and vice versa.
Well, this is a great place to take a break. We'll come back to this really amazing and powerful conversation with Kelly Lynch in a minute.
Our mission at Responder Wellness, Inc. is to subsidize or provide free of charge safety equipment and wellness services to first responders, including police officers, firefighters, EMS personnel, and 911 operators throughout Connecticut. Resources include scholarships to train new EMTs, a responder and veteran-only AA group in Danbury, Connecticut, as well as police vests, a fire and EMS boot program, yoga classes, gym memberships, and T-shirts. The founder of Responder Wellness, Inc. co-leads a peer support group sponsored by Fairfield County Trauma Response Team. Responder Wellness, Inc. is a nonprofit 501c3. Find us on the web at responderwellness.org, on Facebook at Responder Wellness, Inc., or email us responderwellness@gmail.com. Responder Wellness, Inc., putting responders first.
And welcome back, Responder Resilience. We're speaking with Kelly Lynch of Turning Point Wellness, LLC, about nutrition practices for first responders. Stacy, do you have another question for Kelly?
Well, how do you think first responders can be more proactive with their nutrition? I know we talked about meal prep. Is there anything else that they can do? Is there a bigger picture that they need to take into consideration in addition to nutrition?
Sure. So, in terms of the simple parts around it, part of it is meal prep. Part of it is understanding how to be creative with food choices when you're out on the road. One of the things that I joke around quite frequently with my EMS clients is gas station cuisine and how to make healthy choices when you have to just make a fast pit stop, grab a piece of fruit instead of the coffee, right? Quick fun fact, an apple contains 13 grams of sugar, which is the same amount of energy contained in 1 cup of coffee.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So if you're dragging in the afternoon and you know that you're going to need to go to bed at night, grab an apple instead of coffee. It takes us also about 24 hours to fully metabolize caffeine. So that caffeine, even if you're not getting that caffeine high for that full 24 hours, it's still in your system for that long. So those are the ground level pieces, but even below that, the bigger picture part, I would say, is choice and motivation. And this is something that a lot of people don't take the time to think about when it comes to our nutrition habits. What choices are you making based on the motivation that you have? And when you don't feel very motivated, what ends up creating motivation really is the momentum we have towards the goals that we're setting. So a lot of what I work on around nutrition with my clients is goal setting, understanding how to make choices that support those goals, and then how to remain motivated in the context of working towards that.
Well, I would love to know what you think about this, or what you tell your clients on this subject. So from the firehouse culture, and I'm sure this happens in police departments and EMS departments, the food can sometimes roll in crazy amounts of food.
Sure.
Sometimes as soon as we finish dinner, all of a sudden trays of food are appearing around the holidays, copious amounts of food, and obviously very, sugary, high carb foods are there. What kind of advice do you give your clients as far as how to deal with that?
So a lot of that is just boundary setting, and really, like I said about choice and motivation, understanding, how, if you're going to make the choice to partake and indulge, Okay, fine. But how does that affect your progress towards the goals that you're trying to achieve? Does it help? Does it hurt? Does the one donut one time, is it going to be an earth-shattering event? Probably not. But one donut 17 times is probably going to make a difference. So, like I said, again, just really emphasizing the ideas of choice and motivation and how that supports us or hurts us, depending on the context, is really just the conversation.
So, David, I wanted to ask you about, in the firehouse, because you were just talking about all the copious foods that come on. Were there any trends that happened within the fire department as far as diets, what was working, what wasn't working? What did you notice?
There was a period of time when it was one diet after another that groups of guys would do together because it was the next big thing. So
Such as what?
The Dukan diet, keto, paleo, some kinds of combinations of high carb or low carb, high fat, high protein.
Right.
And it got to the point where there was even almost like pools of money, guys would all kick in money who were doing this weight loss program, and whoever lost the most amount of weight would win the pool. So my question for Kelly is, do these diets work? And, if not, what's a reasonable alternative?
So the best answer I could give for a question like that is it depends. It depends on the person. It depends on their biological makeup, their physiological makeup, and the environment that they're applying it in. I'll use keto specifically as an example. Keto for months now, or close to a year, honestly, maybe even a little bit longer than that, has been all the rage. But what people don't realize about keto is that it's really specifically designed for two categories of our population: folks who have seizure disorders and folks who are diabetics.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Because of the low carb,
high fat.
Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Keto has been found to actually be really effective for folks who are diagnosed with a seizure disorder. But for the everyday Joe, it's just a thing that maybe it's going to work depending on how you apply it and how consistent you are with it.
Right.
But for the everyday average person walking around, the most important thing to pay attention to, regardless of the diet per se that you're choosing, is that it's really about calories in versus calories out. If we're focusing on fat loss, calories in versus calories out is the foundation piece that we don't think about often enough. It is very, very simple. And it's just a matter of thinking about, are you exercising to burn more than what you're actually taking in?
That makes sense. What about, I've heard about blood type diets, like that we all have different blood type. And so we should eat different foods to support our genetics based on our blood type. What do you think about that?
I had the same answer, right? It really
depends on the person.
It depends on the person. It depends on their medical history, their family history, what environment they are in and out of every single day, based on which is going to affect their stress levels, and then calories in versus calories out.
I was going to say, just the other key piece always seems to be sustainability. How long, are these going to work? And
exactly,
my, what I saw go down was it would work. They'd be into it for 3, 4, maybe 5 months, and then it got whatever it is. They burn out on it. They just have to go back to more of a normal diet.
Exactly,
and it just doesn't sustain.
Yeah, if I looked at keto specifically, if I try to go low carb, I am not a good human to be around.
Oh, really? Yeah. It affects your mood.
Yes, hugely. So keto for me would not be, you get a really big hit of fat loss on keto because it's so low carb.
Sure.
But for me personally, keto would be the absolute wrong decision because it is not a sustainable lifestyle. But instead, if I focus on portion sizing and calories in versus calories out, right? Like I'm a proponent of macro counting for folks who are able to sustain that. That's a really good strategy of just keep it simple.
I have another question. it's sort of just off the top of my head. As I think about from a clinical perspective, I sit with a lot of first responders who are really not in touch with their emotions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they're either numb or they've kind of taken the emotions and kind of pushed them out. Do you think that there's a draw to, if you're kind of numb or you're just kind of tucking things away and you're kind of going through the day, that where food, if it tastes really good, that it can kind of break through the numbness and kind of give you something to look forward to? So you got the, spicy foods, you got fried foods, you got really sugary things that are really intense, because, everybody loves an adrenaline rush too, if you're a first responder, it seems.
Sure.
So don't you think that that's part of the, why diet can be so poor for first responders?
Sure, because it's as much of an addiction as anything else is too. We get addicted to the quick hit that we get from these highly
intense
processed
flavor or intense flavor.
Yeah, so it's the highly processed, hyper palatable foods. That's the language around it, right?
Okay,
Of the intense flavors. It's the McDonald's and the Burger King and the Chipotle and the how much sriracha can you throw on to something, right?
Yeah.
Or how much creamer can you put in your coffee to make it taste just ever so slightly different, or a whole lot like now I'm adding coffee to my creamer kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's the highly processed, hyper palatable food is the language we put around it. But it's as much of an addiction as anything else is.
Right. And it comes down to what emotions are you struggling with that you're kind of,
Absolutely.
it's kind of guiding your diet at this point. That's where the whole emotional eating comes in. So I understand that you have an upcoming ebook about the identity of the first responder, how not to lose yourself in the world of public safety. So I think this would be a good time for you to talk about that.
Yeah, so the ebook should be coming out, if I really have my act together. I'm aiming for January, and this entire book revolves around how much we can end up identifying with the role of being a first responder, and we kind of just get consumed by what this world looks like. There is so much about this role that becomes so incredibly important. I haven't been on the road since 2012. But I still identify part of who I am as a former first responder, right? That EMS is a hugely impactful part of what my life has looked like and become. So being in public safety and being part of the first responder world is something that people end up prioritizing for a lot of different reasons. And the most important thing that we can do for ourselves is not get lost inside of that. Yeah. Because as much as being a first responder matters, there's so many other parts of who we are that also matter that we need to give just as much time and attention to.
Right. So hence losing oneself within the profession and really not putting yourself first.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Kelly, I know you offer some classes and other types of courses. How can people find those?
So you can go to my website, which is www.turningpointwellnessllc.com. And under classes and consultation, there's some free downloads that are available on there, where I have a free download for self-care and also for sleep habits that I like to call sleep hygiene, so that we can really work on changing the way that we take good care of ourselves.
Great. And is there anything else we didn't talk about that you'd like to share?
I think the only other thing that's important to look at here is what aspect of the public safety world somebody works in. David, you had mentioned what the environment is like around food in the firehouse. And what that immediately made me think of is what the environment around food is like in the commercial EMS world. And it's totally different. You'll hear a lot of commercial EMS people joking around about dashboard cuisine and how fast can you get your next meal in on the way to your next 911.
Wow.
And there's a family family aspect around food in the firehouse that doesn't necessarily exist in other aspects of public safety.
True.
Yes.
And one is not necessarily better or worse than the other. They're just different. So when we look at food choices, food habits, food behaviors, whatever else comes in the context of those kinds of conversations, environment is always a huge factor that needs to be taken into account.
Thank you. Where can people find you out there in social media, otherwise?
On Facebook and on Instagram, you can find me at the handle at I am Kelly Lynch. On Facebook, it's going to pull up my business page, which is Turning Point Wellness, but the handle is I am Kelly Lynch.
Great. Kelly, this has been a really, really, I think, very helpful conversation, so much good information. And I think it's only just scratching the surface, but we really appreciate you spending time with us on this episode. And we hope that it's helpful for people out there. It seems like it's very, very critical things to look at in terms of sustainability of a long career in emergency services.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure.
Thank you.